One waitress stood up to bullies for an old biker and lost her job. What happened next would shake the town to its core. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Rusty's roadside diner, casting golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on her apron and surveyed the half-empty restaurant with tired eyes. At 28, she already felt the weight of years on her shoulders, single mom, 2 jobs, and barely making ends meet. But the diner was her sanctuary, a place where the regulars treated her like family. "More coffee, Earl?" she asked, approaching a weathered farmer hunched over his breakfast plate. The old man nodded gratefully, and Sarah topped off his mug with practiced precision. These were her people, the early risers, the working class, the backbone of Millfield. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah glanced up to see Frank Thompson making his slow, determined way into the diner. At 72, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. But there was nothing weak about him. His leather vest was adorned with patches from decades of riding. Vietnam veteran, Rolling Thunder, American Legion, each. One telling a story of a life lived without compromise. "Morning, Frank," Sarah called out, already reaching for a clean mug. "Corner booth's free." Frank nodded appreciatively, maneuvering himself into his usual spot by the window. Sarah noticed him wince slightly as he sat down. "Knee bothering you?" "Again?" she asked, setting his black coffee down and pulling out her notepad. Frank shrugged, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Nothing that good food and better company won't fix. The usual, please." "Coming right up," Sarah replied, placing the order ticket on the kitchen carousel. She had a soft spot for Frank. He reminded her of her grandfather, tough as nails on the outside but gentle at heart. Frank never talked much about his past, but the respect he showed everyone, from the dishwasher to the owner, told Sarah everything she needed to know about his character. The lunch rush had just begun to taper off when the trouble walked in. 3 teenage boys, probably 16 or 17, swaggered through the door in a cloud of expensive cologne and entitlement. Sarah recognized them vaguely. The ringleader was Jason Mercer, son of the town's wealthiest developer. The boys claimed a booth near Frank, loudly dragging chairs from other tables to accommodate their sprawled postures. "Can I get you boys some menus?" Sarah asked, approaching with professional politeness despite her immediate dislike of their demeanor. 3 chocolate shakes and fries," Jason said without looking up from his phone. "And make it quick. We've got places to be?" Sarah nodded and turned away, but not before catching the smirk Jason directed at his friends as he nodded toward Frank's corner booth. Something tightened in her stomach. A warning. As she prepared their order, she kept an eye on the situation. Frank sat quietly, focused on his newspaper and meal, seemingly oblivious to the boys. But as Sarah emerged from the kitchen, she saw Jason make his move. He stood up, casually stretching, and accidentally knocked into Frank's table, sending coffee sloshing across the newspaper. "Watch where you put your stuff, old man," Jason said loudly. His friends snickered. Frank looked up slowly, his blue eyes steady. "No harm done," he said quietly, using his napkin to mop up the spill. But Jason wasn't satisfied. He reached over and fingered one of Frank's patches. "Vietnam? My dad says you guys lost that war anyway." Sarah saw Frank stiffen. She knew that for men like him, those patches weren't fashion statements. They were sacred symbols of brotherhood and sacrifice. "I think it's time for you boys to leave," she said firmly, setting down their order and standing protectively near Frank's table. Jason turned his attention to her, his smile turning ugly. "We haven't even started eating, and nobody asked for your opinion, waitress." "The young lady asked you to leave," Frank said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced far worse than teenage bravado. "I suggest you do so. Or What, Grandpa? Jason leaned in closer. You gonna call your biker gang? Oh, wait, they're probably all dead or in nursing homes. That's when Jason made his fatal mistake. He reached out and deliberately flicked the Vietnam veteran patch on Frank's vest. This doesn't make you special, old man. It just makes you a sucker who couldn't dodge the draft. Without hesitation, Sarah stepped between them, her eyes flashing. That's enough. Get out now, or I'm calling the police. Jason laughed. My dad plays golf with Chief Wilson. Good luck with that. I don't care if your dad plays checkers with the president, Sarah shot back. In this diner, you show respect or you leave. By now, the entire restaurant had fallen silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Jason's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing they'd crossed a line. You can't talk to me like that, Jason sneered, his face reddening. I'll have your job. It would be worth it, Sarah replied steadily. Now take your milkshakes to go. You're not welcome here. Do you know who my father is? Jason demanded, his voice rising. A failure at raising his son, apparently, Frank commented quietly, causing several diners to stifle laughs. Jason lunged toward Frank, but Sarah was faster. She stepped completely in front of the elderly veteran, shielding him with her body. Touch him, and I promise you'll regret it, she warned, her voice low and dangerous. Something in her eyes must have convinced Jason she meant business. He backed, up, knocking over a chair in the process. Whatever. This place is a dump anyway, he muttered, gesturing to his friends. Let's go. As they stalked toward the door, Jason turned back. My dad owns the company that leases this building. Don't think this is over. The bell jangled angrily as they left. A smattering of applause broke out among the other diners. Sarah's hands were shaking as she began cleaning up the spilled coffee. You shouldn't have done that, Frank said quietly. Not on my account. Sarah smiled. Those boys needed a lesson in respect. Besides, nobody messes with my favorite customer. Frank reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. Thank you, he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. 2 hours later, Sarah was called into the manager's office. Stan Reynolds, the owner of Rusty's, looked uncomfortable as she entered. Close the door, Sarah, he said, not meeting her eyes. Sarah knew what was coming before he even spoke. It's about those boys, isn't it? Stan nodded miserably. Jason's, father called. He's threatening to terminate our lease unless... He trailed off. Unless you fire me, Sarah finished for him. I don't want to, Stan insisted. You're the best waitress I've got. But Sarah, if we lose this location, 20 people lose their jobs, not just you. Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. She couldn't afford to be unemployed, not with rent due and Lily's school expenses. But she also couldn't regret standing up for Frank. I understand, she said quietly. Stan handed her an envelope. 2 weeks' pay, plus your tips from today. I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am. Sarah nodded, fighting, back tears as she cleaned out her locker. As she walked out the front door of Rusty's one last time, she wondered how she would tell her daughter that Mommy had lost her job defending an old biker's honor. Frank wasn't at the diner when Sarah was fired, but word travels fast in small towns. By the time Sarah arrived home to her modest apartment, her phone was buzzing with text messages from co-workers sharing the news. She had just finished explaining the situation to her confused 8-year-old daughter when a knock came at the door. Wiping her eyes, Sarah opened it to find Frank standing there, looking uncomfortable in his leather vest. I heard what happened, he said gruffly. May I come in? Sarah nodded, stepping aside. Frank entered slowly, taking in the small but tidy apartment with observant eyes. This is my daughter, Lily, Sarah introduced them. Lily, this is Mr. Frank, a customer from the diner. Frank smiled at the little girl. Nice to meet you, Miss Lily. Your mom is quite a lady. Lily nodded solemnly. She said she got fired for being nice to you. Frank's face darkened. That's not right, and it's not going to stand. He turned to Sarah. I made some calls. Calls? Sarah asked, confused. To some old friends, Frank explained. We take care of our own. And after what you did today, you're one of us now. Before Sarah could ask for clarification, her phone rang. It was Stan from the diner, sounding panicked. Sarah, you need to get down here. There's hundreds of them. Hundreds of what? She asked, confused. Bikers, Stan replied. They filled the parking lot and they're asking for you. What did you do? Sarah looked at Frank, who was smiling mysteriously. Give us 15 minutes, she told Stan, then hung up. The rumble of motorcycles could be heard from blocks away as Sarah's car approached Rusty's diner. What she saw made her gasp. The parking lot, the street, and every available space was filled with motorcycles. Harleys, Indians, Triumphs, bikes of every description. Men and women in leather vests stood in groups, their patches identifying them as members of various clubs: Rolling Thunder, American Legion riders, VFW riders, and dozens more. What is this? Sarah whispered as Frank helped her from the car. This, said Frank proudly, is family taking care of family. A tall, imposing man with a salt and pepper beard approached them. This the girl, Frank? He asked. Frank nodded. Sarah, meet Jack Hammer Wilson, president of the Veterans Motorcycle Coalition. Jack, this is Sarah Martinez, the lady I told you about. Jack extended a massive hand to Sarah. Ma'am, it's an honor. What you did for our brother Frank, standing up when nobody else would, that means something to us. Sarah shook his hand, overwhelmed. I just did what anyone should have done, but they didn't, Jack replied. You did. And now you've got 500 friends you didn't have this morning. The crowd parted as Jason Mercer's father arrived in his luxury SUV, his face paling at the sight of the assembled bikers. Stan hurried out of the diner, looking from the bikers to Mr. Mercer in panic. What's going on here? Mr. Mercer demanded, trying to maintain his composure. Jack stepped forward. Community meeting, he said pleasantly. We're discussing respect, honor, and the consequences of messing with our friends. Is this some kind of threat? Mercer asked, his voice rising. Not at all, Frank interjected smoothly. Just a reminder that this town isn't run by one man. These folks... He gestured to the assembled riders. They spend money too. They eat at restaurants, shop at stores, buy houses, and they're very particular about supporting businesses that share their values. Mr. Mercer looked around at the sea of leather-clad bikers, many wearing veteran patches, and seemed to deflate slightly. What do you want? Sarah gets her job. Back, with a raise, Frank stated firmly. And you teach your boy some manners. Or what? Mercer challenged, though with less conviction. Jack smiled, revealing teeth that had seen a few fights. Or every business you own suddenly becomes very unpopular with a large, loyal, and vocal customer base. We're peaceful folks, Mr. Mercer. But we vote with our wallets, and there are chapters like ours all over this state. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in the middle of Rusty's diner, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the scene unfold before her. Stan, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and embarrassment, had just rehired her on the spot. Not only that, but he'd added a $1 per hour raise and a promotion to shift supervisor, something she'd been quietly hoping for over the past year. The paper he'd hastily drafted and signed sat folded in her apron pocket, a tangible reminder that sometimes justice does prevail. Mr. Mercer had retreated to his luxury SUV, his earlier arrogance deflated by the sea of leather-clad bikers who had stood as silent witnesses to his comeuppance. Before leaving, he had mumbled promises about addressing the situation with Jason and ensuring nothing like this happens again. Sarah didn't entirely believe him, but she recognized the look of a man who had just discovered that money couldn't solve every problem. The veterans had organized themselves with military precision. Jack Hammer Wilson had appointed group leaders. each responsible for bringing in 20 riders at a time so as not to overwhelm the small diner. Every 30 minutes, like clockwork, one group would exit and another would enter, ensuring Rusty's would enjoy unprecedented business for the entire day. The parking lot had become an impromptu gathering place, with bikers sharing stories, comparing patches, and occasionally casting protective glances toward the diner where Sarah worked. Inside, Sarah moved from table to table in a daze. She'd tied on a fresh apron, one that Earl's wife had embroidered with her name last Christmas, and fought back tears as she greeted each new group of bikers. These were men and women she might have passed on the street without a second glance a day ago. Now they greeted her like a long-lost sister, many standing to shake her hand or even offer brief, awkward hugs before sitting down. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said softly to Frank, who had reclaimed his usual corner booth. The old biker sat with his back to the wall, a habit from years of vigilance, nursing a coffee that never seemed to empty as other riders continually topped, it often a gesture of respect. Frank shook his head, the overhead light catching the silver in his beard. "You stood up for one of us, when it would have been easier not to," he said, his weathered voice carrying a weight of emotion that made Sarah's throat tighten. "That's what today is about. Showing you that when you stand for what's right, you never stand alone." A burly rider with road captain patches sat across from Frank, nodding in agreement. "Brotherhood and sisterhood isn't about who you ride with," he added. "It's about who you stand with when the chips are down." Sarah blinked back tears and looked around at the diner, now transformed. The usual quiet hum of conversation had been replaced by the boisterous camaraderie of the motorcycle community. Men with graying beards and faded tattoos sat alongside younger riders. Women riders claimed their space with the confidence of those accustomed to proving themselves, and veterans of different eras found common ground in their shared experiences. Every booth and counter seat was occupied, with riders deliberately ordering the most expensive items on the menu, the steak and eggs, the loaded omelets, extra sides of bacon, and leaving tips that often exceeded the bill itself. At one point, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee machine. She barely recognized herself. Gone was the defeated slump of her shoulders from earlier that day, replaced by a posture of quiet dignity. She thought about Lily, waiting at a neighbor's house, and the lessons her daughter would learn from this day. About courage, community, and standing up for what's right regardless of the cost. She wondered how to explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes losing your job can lead to finding your tribe. The kitchen staff worked at a frantic pace, sweat beading on their foreheads as they prepared more food in one afternoon than they typically did in 3 days. Marco, the usually sullen line cook who rarely spoke to the waitstaff, caught Sarah's eye across the pass-through window and gave her a thumbs up, his face flushed with the excitement and pride of being part of the busiest and most meaningful day in Rusty's history. "Order up!" he called for what seemed like the 100th time that afternoon, sliding plates heaped with food onto the counter. Sarah grabbed the plates and moved through the crowd, delivering meals with a pride she'd never felt before. Each thank you from a leather-clad customer carried a deeper meaning now. She wasn't just serving food, she was being embraced by a community that valued honor above all else. Word spread quickly through the small town of Millfield. By mid-afternoon, local residents began appearing at the diner's entrance, curious about the motorcycle invasion. Some came inside to show their support, awkwardly navigating the unfamiliar territory of biker etiquette, but welcomed nonetheless. Others stood outside, taking pictures and sharing the unfolding story on social media. By evening, the local news station had sent a young reporter, her eyes wide with excitement at covering something more interesting than the usual town council meetings. "Can you tell us what prompted this amazing show of solidarity?" the reporter asked Sarah during a brief lull between serving tables. Sarah glanced at Frank, who nodded encouragingly. "It's about respect," she said simply. respecting our veterans, respecting each other, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The reporter looked disappointed at the brevity of the answer, clearly hoping for something more dramatic. But the bikers within earshot nodded in approval. They understood that some things couldn't and shouldn't be reduced to sound bites. As evening descended on Millfield, bathing the town in the golden light of a fading spring day, the crowd at Rusty's began to thin. The last group of riders finished their meals, leaving tips that made the younger waitresses gasp. Stan, who had spent most of the day alternating between apologizing to Sarah and marveling at his register receipts, finally retreated to his office to count the day's unprecedented earnings. The parking lot emptied gradually, with departing bikers, stopping to shake Frank's hand or pat Sarah's shoulder on their way out. Long shadows stretched across the asphalt as the sun began its final descent, painting the scene in hues of amber and gold. Sarah, exhausted but exhilarated, finally slid into the seat across from Frank in his corner booth during her first break of the day. "Why did you do all this for me?" she asked quietly, massaging her aching feet under the table. The question had been burning in her mind all day, through every order taken and every plate delivered. Frank studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful beneath bushy gray eyebrows. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still strong, turned his coffee mug in slow circles as he gathered his thoughts. "Because 30 years ago," he finally said, "I was on a motorcycle trip through a small town in Oregon. Some local boys decided the old biker wasn't welcome there. They slashed my tires, vandalized my bike. Nobody in that town would help me, except one waitress at a diner who let me use her phone, gave me a free meal, and even drove me to the next town to get parts." He paused, the memory clearly still vivid after all these years. "Her name was Eleanor. She had 2 kids and worked double shifts, just like you. Never complained, never asked for anything in return." A smile softened his weathered face as he noticed Sarah's surprised expression. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact. That waitress never knew that I went on to start a scholarship fund for kids in her town. 2 of her own grandchildren ended up benefiting from it, though she never knew I was behind it. You never know how standing up for someone might change things. Sarah absorbed this revelation, understanding now that today was about more than just her. It was about an unbroken chain of kindness and respect that had been passing from person to person for decades, perhaps even centuries. "The world's got a way of balancing things out," Frank continued. "Not always as quickly as we'd like, not always in ways we expect, but it happens. Today was your balance coming due." Through the front windows of the diner, Sarah could see the remaining dozen or so bikers in the parking lot, men and women of all ages and backgrounds, united by respect and a code of honor that transcended the differences society so often used to divide people. Jack Hammer Wilson was deep in conversation with a young female rider, pointing out features on her motorcycle with the patience of a seasoned mentor. 2 Vietnam veterans compared patches with a recent Afghanistan returnee, 3 generations of warriors finding common ground. "Will I see you tomorrow morning?" she asked Frank, suddenly afraid that this magical day might signal the end of their friendship rather than a new beginning. "Coffee's on the house," Frank chuckled, the sound rumbling from deep in his chest. "Wouldn't miss it, but don't you go giving away free coffee. You've got a daughter to support." He reached across the table and patted her hand. "Besides, these old bones need somewhere warm to rest in the mornings." "Same corner booth," Sarah promised. Then, hesitating only briefly, she added, "And maybe someday you could meet Lily properly. I think she'd like to hear some of your stories." Something flickered in Frank's eyes. Surprise, pleasure, perhaps even a touch of the loneliness he usually kept well hidden. "I'd like that," he said simply. As the day's final light faded from the sky, Frank made his way slowly to his motorcycle, a meticulously maintained Harley-Davidson that had seen nearly as many miles as its owner. Sarah watched from the doorway of the diner as he exchanged final handshakes and brotherhood embraces with the remaining riders. She realized something important had changed today, something fundamental in the way she viewed the world and her place in it. She had stood up for what was right, lost everything, and found something greater in return. A community that valued courage over convenience and principle over profit. The diner that had been merely her workplace now felt like sacred ground, consecrated by the gathering of people who understood that honor wasn't an outdated concept, but a living, breathing force that could still change lives. Jack approached her before mounting his own massive cruiser. "You ever need anything at all, you call Frank. He knows how to reach us," he said, pressing a business card into her hand. "Your family now." And as Frank's brothers and sisters in leather fired up their engines, creating a thunderous symphony that echoed through the streets of Millfield, Sarah knew that the story of the Waitress and the 500 bikers would be told and retold for years to come. Not just as a curiosity or a moment of small-town drama, but as a reminder that in a world that often seemed to reward selfishness, there were still people who would ride hundreds of miles to stand up for what was right. She clutched the business card in her hand, feeling the embossed letters of the Veterans Motorcycle Coalition under her fingertips, and watched until the last taillight disappeared around the corner. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Jason's wounded pride, Mr. Mercer's lingering influence, the curiosity of townspeople who had witnessed today's events. But for the first time in years, Sarah wasn't facing those challenges alone. As she turned to finish her closing duties at the diner, her step was lighter than it had been in years. She hummed softly to herself, already looking forward to picking up Lily and telling her daughter about the day that 500 bikers had taught them both what it truly meant to belong